Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is TBSky, and we're going to be talking about some League of Legends comics today. Why are we going to be talking about League of Legends comics? Well, because Riot has asked me to. Or more specifically, they haven't asked me to do it, but they have asked the community in general to give some feedback on League of Legends comics. I'm more than happy to oblige. This is pretty much my bat signal. So, on the Universe website, they have put out or the Nexus website rather, a column explaining what their philosophy about comics are, what they'd like them to do for the League of Legends universe, and how they feel about the future for comics. I pretty much agree with most of what is in this column, with a couple of exceptions, but we're going to get to those later. First of all, I have put out full videos exploring, analyzing, and criticizing each of the comics that they put out separately. You will find links to those down in the description, along with a link to the column on the Nexus website. So if you want to know my full thoughts on each of these comics, you can go there and check that out. But for now, we're going to do some general feedback on how exactly these comics have worked and what I feel about them. And what I feel about them is, holy crap, yes, thank you. I am extremely happy that Riot embraced the medium of comics in order to bring stories about their champions to the people, because comics are a fantastic format for the purpose. And more than that, the comics that they chose to put out all had very distinct art styles, all had very distinct types of writing, distinct types of narrative, were put out in interesting ways with interesting approaches to publishing. The Nami comic in particular was absolutely brilliant by combining a story about descending into the abyss with a publishing format where the reader has to scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll down, 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 always following Nami's narrative into the abyss with their own actions. That is an extremely clever way to publish a comic. I thought that was brilliant. On the downside, each of the comics that they published are one-shots. And what that means is that they are comics with no prequel or sequel. Essentially, they are comics that contain self-contained stories about something very specific, zooming in on one particular moment or experience or storyline in a champion's life, or experience, excuse me, focusing in on that, finishing a story about that, and then that's that. They are one-shots. They don't really contain within them any substantial expansion of the League of Legends universe. And this is where I have to disagree a little bit with the column on the Nexus website. I'm gonna have a couple of problems with this particular paragraph, but generally speaking, they say, we think it's more interesting when characters end up in a different place than where they started at the beginning of the story. Showing the progression of both champions and the regions they belong to is how we move the narrative of League of Legends forward and continue the world building of Runeterra. Now, I agree with this in principle, but I don't think they managed to do that in the comics that they put out. Unfortunately. Nami and Darius, both of their comics were origin stories, essentially. Especially Nami's was just a retelling of her origin story in full, and Darius was more of a, oh, by the way, he used to have a girlfriend, sort of, a friend who was a lady, and they also did some sex sometimes, and then that lady died, and that's part of his tragic backstory with Noxus, but it was only backstory. It was an expansion of the character as we already know him. The same thing goes for Nami. Nothing about Nami or Darius has been changed by either of the comics that have been put out, but some of it has been expanded. And that's fine. Like, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but if the goal was to leave the champions in a different place than when they began, not really. The champions as we know them are still exactly the same. There was really no progression. The same thing goes for the Ziggs and Jinx comic, where Jinx maybe has a bit of character development, Ziggs maybe has a bit of character development, but it's not really clear when this comic takes place or what context it takes place in within the League of Legends universe, and it's pretty much the entire story is just Ziggs and Jinx bouncing their personalities off each other in a natural way, forming a hilarious friendship and going to Zaun. But Jinx is already kind of from Zaun, so I don't know. It didn't really move the world forward. It didn't really move the champions meaningfully forward. Misfortune comes closest to having a meaningful character development, but honestly, the comic is about how in the aftermath of supplanting Gangplank as leader of Bilgewater, she is perhaps filling his shoes a little bit too well. She is resorting to some of the same violent methods that she resented in him. That's an interesting bit of character development, but it is still only an exploration of the status quo that we were left with after Burning Tides. It is not really moving the character forward in any major way. And again, because the comics are one-shots, that's just kind of how it goes. You kind of can't, because you only have so many pages and you have to focus on something that's interesting, which means you can't just barrel ahead with the story because there's not enough space, there's not enough time to do it well. One-shots have to be self-contained. That's unfortunately just the way it goes. So, the comics themselves are fine. I don't think they quite accomplished the goals that they put out in the column on the website, but they were fine in and of themselves. So let's talk about what comics can do for League of Legends lore as a whole, what they can do in the future, how they can expand on things. And here again, I'm going to have a little bit of a problem with this particular paragraph in the column on the website. More than fight porn. We've talked about this before, and it's true for comics too. Generally speaking, we think it's more interesting when a character ends up in a different place than where they started at the beginning of the story. That's true. I mean, it is true. Like, generally speaking, the best comics in the world are the ones that have some kind of character progression or tell some kind of completed narrative arc about a character and their motivations and how they feel and where they're going, what's going on. But I don't think the only good comics behave that way. I think, to put it another way, fight porn is enough. Sometimes fight porn is enough. And sometimes going 110%, moving the world forward, changing everything, apocalyptic changes to the universe, or even just character progression, sometimes that 110% effort is too much. And this goes back to the general state of League of Legends lore, which is a little bit in a shambles. I mean, it just is. I know that internally, Riot are working substantially on fleshing out the League of Legends cosmology, trying to create a universe with this weird-ass jigsaw of disparate characters makes sense as part of some kind of cohesive world. I know they've done a lot of work internally on it. I know they've been trying to show it off in the lore updates they've been doing to the regions recently. But League of Legends lore is still a mess. It just is. As an outsider, as a spectator, as a part of the audience, League of Legends lore is a big mess. It doesn't fit together coherently yet. So, what we're left with because of that is that there are a lot of characters who just don't have a lore presence. They just don't. Like, when is the last time Annie did something in the lore? When's the last time Fiddlesticks did something? When's the last time Alistar did something? When is the last time, you know, anything happened to a lot of the old characters? When is the last time that Jarvan had a new adventure? The last time we saw a lore update for him was just a retcon of his backstory. Nothing's really happened. And by the way, ever since Burning Tides, barely anything has happened to the Bilgewater characters. Ever since the massive Shurima lore updates, we haven't heard anything from a Seer or Sivir, who had this big storyline set up about how Sivir is actually a late descendant of Azir, and he's supposed to have some kind of interaction with her, and something about the future of Shurima. We haven't seen anything about Talia and Yasuo since Talia was released, where they have this master-pupil relationship that was kind of important to Talia and to Yasuo himself, and what happened with that since then? Months, years pass without anything happening to most characters in the League of Legends lore. I think I can count on one hand the number of characters in League of Legends lore that have had anything happen to them within the last month of real-world time. Two hands, perhaps, when we're talking within the last year. And several characters who it's been years and years since we've heard anything about. And part of the reason is that Riot believes, at least according to their column, and also going by their behavior, that when they put out something, they have to go 110%. If we're going to do something for the Demacian champions, we're going to do a huge Demacia region update for all of the champions with Shyvana and Jarvan and Garen and Lux. And now Demacia is a fascist state that outlaws magic, and Lux is secretly a magician, and she's also a secret agent. And Garen is this kind of general he's a good guy, but he's kind of trapped by his ideals that magic is kind of evil, so he has to maybe kill his sister if he ever finds out she's a mage, and blah, blah, blah. And then absolutely nothing happens because we're moving on to the next thing. And then it's the Son lore update where Zac actually, he's not raised by happy parents. His parents are actually dead, and he's kind of a dark avenger who is roaming the streets of Son. And then we move on to the next thing. And nothing happens there. And Echo gets a lore update. And Riot dumps a ton of lore on our heads. And then they move on, and nothing happens because they will not put out the next thing until they feel it is 110% ready, until they feel it is more than fight porn. My argument is that the thing that comics can do for League of Legends is maintenance. And maintenance is underrated. I think maintenance is important. And what I mean by maintenance is, what's Annie up to right now? We don't have a major lore event necessarily coming up where we can explore exactly what she's been doing and how she's been interacting with the entire rest of the League of Legends universe. But maybe we could have a comic strip that updates every other weekday, where it's Annie and Tippers, and it's kind of like a Garfield comic where Annie is doing stuff in Noxus and Tippers is kind of acting like Garfield, just commenting on things in a sardonic way, which doesn't change the world. It doesn't move things forward. It doesn't leave the character in a different place than where it started. It doesn't change the region of Noxus. But it keeps us up to date. It keeps maintenance going on Annie and Tippers and whatever characters happen to be in their immediate vicinity. Maybe we could have a monthly comic that is put out like in chapters, like a manga, just about Garen and Lux. Not about many of the other Demacia characters, not about changing the nature of Demacia, but just about Garen and Lux hanging out at home and things being really awkward because Lux has to try and hide her magic all the time. And it could be framed as a sort of funny comedy, a sitcom. Doesn't change the world, doesn't change the characters, but it keeps some maintenance going. It keeps the lore alive. Because the lore of League of Legends, in my head, is dead. By which I don't mean that there's no lore or that it's not interesting, but it's not breathing, it's not alive, it doesn't have any regular, reliable output. Lore has to breathe, stories have to breathe. I fervently believe that. And that breath has to be regular and consistent. There has to be an intake as they prepare for content, and then they breathe it out. And then there's an intake and they breathe it out. And this is how, when you think about it, most content goes. Marvel follows this formula with their movies and with their comics. DC follows this formula. Star Wars follows this formula, at least ever since they were acquired by Disney. Star Trek often follows this formula. Expanded universes for various properties tend to follow this formula, that there's always something coming up. There's always a new Star Wars movie on the horizon, and there's gonna be one for the next 100 years if Disney has their way. There's always a new Marvel movie on the horizon. There's always something coming. There's always this regular output where we can catch up with characters, where we can catch up with this world, and remember, oh yeah, that's what this is like. That's where this is. And that is how you form a community. That is how you form a community around a story, by having output which is consistent, which is reliable, where people can say, next Monday, there's a new thing coming out in this story that I follow, and I'm going to make some time and I'm going to read that, and then I'm going to update, my Twitter with a reaction to it. I'm going to write a fanfic, or I'm going to care about it some way. You have to have that. And that's the thing that League of Legends lore doesn't have. This is my opinion, obviously. This is not, story science or something. This is my opinion about how these things work. And I believe I have some credibility when it comes to these things because I've been a comic artist myself for over a decade at this point. There has to be output, it has to be regular, it has to be consistent. And that's the thing that comic can do, because comics are low-effort content. And I'm putting giant air quotes around that when I say it. Comics are low-effort content. They are low-resource content. Not because they're easy, or not because they're not real art or they're real quality stuff, but in order to do a comic, you need a writer and you need an artist. And a lot of the time, those two people can be the same person. That's how I do pretty much all the comics I do. You can also expand the team and have a writer and a penciler and an inker and ink artist and a colorist and an editor and a lead editor and a guy who does word balloons only. You can expand the team as much as you want, but in order to do a comic, you really only need one person. So you don't need to invest that many resources. And this is what comics can do for the League of Legends lore. My suggestion, not knowing very much about the internal organization of the Riot Narrative team, not knowing very much about their future plans or how they want to expand their lore, is create small teams and give them small groups of characters and let those characters breathe. Make a gag comic for Annie. Make a weekly illustration series for Amumu where every week he finds a new way to not find a friend, and it's funny because it's a meme joke, and make a comic about Timo annoying other people, and make small stuff that doesn't change the world, that isn't at 110%. Make a comic that's just fight porn, a comic that's just about Jax going around the world and fighting people because that's what he does, that's what he likes to do. And in so doing, you can explore those characters a little bit. You can get a sense of how they react, how they bounce off each other, how they think about things, how they talk. And in that sense, keep them alive in the minds of people. And then every once in a while, when the stars align and you're ready to do a big thing and give it 110% and throw all in on it, and it's not just fight porn anymore, now we're doing this thing for real, bring it all together and have a blowout, have a party, do your Avengers every couple of years. But keep the lore alive. This is what comics can do for the League of Legends lore. This is what I would like to see it do. And in order to do it, Riot has to be okay with the retcon. They have to be a lot more okay with failure. And Riot, not that Riot is necessarily afraid of failure, I happen to know from talking to Rioters that for everything that Riot puts out, there's probably 100 things that they did internally that almost got put out but got cancelled because they didn't live up to expectations, or they didn't fit, or they didn't work. Riot are used to things not working, and they're not afraid of canceling stuff if it's not good enough. So that's not the thing I'm implying when I say that Riot has to be okay with failure. But Riot has to be okay with putting something out, some lore content, some comic or something, that 6 months down the line, when a new champion is released, all of a sudden that old content doesn't work anymore because it's in conflict with something, or because it creates a plot hole. And they have to be okay with that failure. Because to me, as an outsider, it feels like Riot's lore department is terrified to put out something without checking in with every other department first, without checking in with the lore writers and the designers and the skin artists and everyone who's doing stuff to see, is this okay? Does this create any conflicts? Is there anything wrong here? And that's why they tend to end up concentrating all of their lore releases in one big dump, because that's when they finally done all of the work and checked with all of the people and made sure that everything fits, and now we can do this huge update to everything and we're not messing with anything. And I think Riot has to embrace that small failure a little bit more, that sometimes you're just going to have to retcon some shit. Sometimes you put out a storyline and it doesn't work, and you're going to have to retcon it away, or it gets into conflict with something else. And that has to be okay, and it's not a big deal, because, again, that's how Marvel and DC do it. That's how the Star Wars expanded universe does it. That's how all of these massive media properties like League of Legends, with hundreds of characters across dozens of timelines and dozens of regions and dozens of worlds and planets, that's how they do it. They keep things breathing, and anytime something they put out in the past doesn't fit anymore, well, we're just gonna have to retcon our way around it or ignore it. And that's okay, and the fans are okay with it. It doesn't ruin the lore, it doesn't ruin the story, because it doesn't always have to be consistent. Because it's more important that the next story that comes out is good than the old story that you liked always being canon. And please, for the love of God, outsource it. Riot, by the way, Riot has a fantastic collaboration going with Gutter Rat, who did the Academy webcomic, which I don't think enough people even knew about, focused around the skin line for the Academy skins, you know, all the schoolgirl Ari and the delinquent Darius and all that stuff. And they have the one called Punches and Plants, I think, which they're doing with the Risu, which is all about the officer skin line in Piltover, thwarting the advances of criminals. And they're hilarious, and they're fun, and they are low stakes, and they don't change the world, but they keep things alive a little bit. They let the characters bounce off each other. They're entertaining. Outsource more of that stuff. Bring in new people, contractors. Just get someone to do some stuff, and then if they do something that kind of doesn't work, or they should have checked with someone, or it doesn't fit into the lore, don't be all, oh shit, we have to cancel the whole project. Just put it out and then retcon it later if you need to. It's fine. Because you're creating an expectation. When you put out only stuff that's been rigorously checked and everything's fitting together, we're doing this as part of the huge update for the whole world, and everything's rigorous, and we put it out in this huge dump all the time, then you create an expectation that that's how League of Legends lore works. But if Riot is willing to be a little more laissez-faire, if they're willing to be a little bit more, we'll play this by ear, it's okay if some stuff doesn't work, the audience will follow. And they will say, yeah, it's okay if it doesn't work. It was a fun story, but it's not canon, that's fine. I knew it wouldn't be canon from the moment I read it, because I know that League of Legends lore is flexible. Embrace flexibility. Increase the volume of output. Make more comics. Bring in contractors. Get in touch with more of the characters. Let the lore breathe. That, I believe, is 20 minutes of video, and that's probably more than enough. And I think I've made all the points I need to make. So, my name has been TV's Guy. If you have been watching so far, I'm impressed. I hope I said something useful. I hope I said something worthwhile, something inspiring, or something you disagree with. Disagreement is good. If you disagree with it, if you have a different opinion, if you know better, that's great. Then you have tested your opinion against mine and I have lost, and you are better off for it. Leave a comment down below if you are so inclined. I shall try to read and respond to all of them. Leave a like if you want. Leave a dislike if that is how you're feeling. And for now, I suppose all I will say is thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.